Are you wondering if one type of spray paint is better than another for painting wood? I was too. So I grabbed 6 popular spray paints and 2 popular primers to compare them. One of these days I want to spray paint a piece of furniture, but I need to know what the best spray paint is to use before I do that. So I did a simple scratch test to see what paint stuck the best, but I was also able to see what sprayed the best and what had the best coverage. Alright, to set up the test, I cleaned up this old beat up coffee table that I got for free. Then I took it outside and taped it off into 3 sections. One section for bin shellac based primer, another for 123 primer, and another for no primer. You might notice too, I did not scuff sand this before I primed it either. So many people want to skip the prep and go right into the paint, so that is how I tested this one out. I am really curious to see how it turns out without sanding. I ended up getting a lot of overspray on the no primer part, so I quickly wiped that back off. And then I let the primer dry for 2 hours. The primer felt rough, so I lightly sanded it to smooth it out a bit. Here are the spray paints that I used. The budget-friendly Color Place, Krylon Color Maxx, Rustoleum 2 times, Behr, Rusto-oleum Gloss Protective Enamel, and Krylon Fusion. They were all gloss and black, except for the Rusto-oleum 2 times that I could not find in my local stores in black. So I settled for a dark green instead. Before we sprayed each of them, we taped off sections and shook the cans really good for a couple of minutes each. And then I sprayed the Krylon Fusion spray paint, the Rusto-oleum Gloss Protective Enamel, the Behr spray paint, Rusto-oleum 2 times Ultra Cover, Krylon Color Maxx, and the Color Place. After the first coat, here were my thoughts. Alright, so my thoughts are, this is the economy, and the coverage definitely is bad. So far it's working, you can just tell that it doesn't have as good of coverage. For the most part, I feel like they sprayed pretty similar. I mean, they all have similar nozzles. This one, I don't know if I didn't spray it as much or what, but it looks like this one might not have as good of coverage either compared to these. Taylor was saying that this Behr paint right here, so this one was Fusion, Krylon Fusion. The Behr one, he said when I was spraying it, he had to look and see what it was because he thought that it looked really good. Other than that, like this one, which is the Rustoleum Stops Rust one, it's pretty comparable to the Krylon Color Maxx, it seems, and I don't have any complaints about the Rustoleum 2 times coverage. I wish that I could have a black paint on there, but couldn't find black anywhere, so anyways, those are my thoughts right now. After 20 more minutes, I sprayed another coat over each section. Okay, I just sprayed the second coat. I paid more attention to how things actually sprayed. And this one, the Krylon Color Maxx, I really liked how it sprayed. The Rustoleum 2 times sprayed great, and I loved how the Behr sprayed as well. This one felt a little bit different to spray this time, maybe because I didn't wipe off the nozzle. It felt like I had to push harder this time. I don't know. And this one was all right, and that one was all right. Then I left it to dry for a week. Here's what they all looked like 7 days later. Okay, can you tell that the sheens are a little bit different between all of them? All of the paint was labeled as glossy, but Behr, Rustoleum 2 times, Krylon Color Maxx are glossier than the others. Before diving into the scratch test, I removed all of the tape and I made little labels to help identify what was what. You might notice that the primer came off in some spots when I removed the tape, and that's just because I put the tape on too soon after priming, so the primer underneath the tape never stood a chance. I started the scratch test by testing the primer first. Remember, I did not sand this table before painting because so many people want to skip the sanding step. Thankfully, the Behr Shellac primer and the 123 primer held very well when I scratched at it with my fingernail. When I dug in with my fingernail, I was able to scratch it a teeny tiny bit. So I know that the primer was doing a good job of sticking to the table. I'm sure that if I would have scuff sanded before, it would have held even better. Then I scratched at the Krylon Fusion spray paint. The no primer section scratched off very easily. The 123 primer scratched off a little less easily, but some of the scratching took off the primer too. And the Behr primer section only scratched off a little bit, but only scratched off the paint and not the primer. Then I tested the Rustoleum Gloss Protective Enamel. The no primer section scratched off very easily again. The 123 primer section scratched less easily again, and the scratches were down to the wood again. But the Behr primer section did not scratch at all. For the Behr spray paint, the no primer section scratched off easily, but not as easily as the other no primer section so far. The 123 primer section left marks, but I had a hard time actually scratching the paint off. And the Behr primer section was the same as the 123 primer section. It left marks, but it didn't scratch the paint off. The Rust-oluem 2-time spray paint was similar to the Krylon Fusion spray paint. The no primer section scratched easily, except for where the finish on the table was down to bare wood. That part held on so well. So that just proves to me that scuff sanding beforehand definitely helps the paint stick better. The 123 primer section did a little bit better, but still scratched off, and even took the primer with it. The bin primer section scratched off some too, and it even took the primer with it too. The Krylon Color Maxx in the no primer section scratched off pretty much like the other no primer sections. The 1, 2, 3 primer section scratched a little bit less, but the primer scratched off too. And the bin primer section scratched off, but less than the 1, 2, 3 primer section. And still the bin primer scratched off just a little bit too. Finally, the Color Replace spray paint, the budget-friendly option. I was blown away. The no primer section barely scratched at all, and it scratched only where there were scratches in the table before. The 1, 2, 3 primer section didn't hold up as well, but it took the primer with it. And the bin primer section held up really well. It scratched in one spot where there was a scratch on the table before. Overall, the paint and primer scratched more easily in the spots where there were already scratches in the table before being painted. If there weren't so many scratches, the paint and primer probably would have held up better. I'm sure that sanding out the scratches and sanding to remove the sheen would have helped the paint stick better. So, does a certain spray paint stick out in your mind right now as a winner? I thought that the Behr spray paint with either primer, Rustoleum protective enamel spray paint with the bin primer, and then the Color Place with no primer or the bin primer did the best. Out of all of the no primer sections, Color Place blew the others out of the water. Before I really decided on what was the best paint though, I waited another 39 days and did another scratch test. So a total of 46 days after I sprayed the spray paint, I scratched at the paint again. The Krylon Fusion spray paint held up so much better than before. I didn't get any scratching from both of the primer sections. The no primer section scratched just a tiny bit. The Rustoleum Gloss Protective Enamel no primer section continued to scratch. But I had to work really hard to get the 1, 2, 3 primer and the bin primer sections to scratch just a tiny bit. The Behr spray paint did about the same as before. It didn't leave as many marks behind as it did before though. The Rustoleum 2x Ultra Cover Spray Paint did about the same as before as well. The best section was the 123 primer by just a little bit, followed by the bin primer section, the no primer section was definitely the worst as it still scratched off more. Krylon Color Maxx was pretty similar to the last time too. And the Color Place spray paint was very similar to the last time too. Before I get to the overall results, if you liked this video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. It really helps get our videos out to more people, so thank you so much. Okay, it's so hard to compare all of these paints and really choose a winner. There were definitely some that were better than others, but no spray paint made it out of this test without scratching at least a little bit. Like I said earlier, if I would have sanded before, I bet the results would have been better than they are. Also, if there weren't scratches in the surface before I painted, that would have helped the paint chip less, because a lot of the scratches were in the exact spots where scratches were in the table before painting. But still, some paints held on better than others. Behr spray paint was probably the best overall in my opinion. It didn't hold up well with no primer, but it held up very well with 123 primer and bin shellac primer on both of the scratch tests. Rustoleum protective enamel with the bin shellac primer was also a top contender. After a month of drying, the Krylon Fusion spray paint with both primers did very well as well. It did decent in the no primer section as well. And then I was completely shocked. But the Color Place spray paint, the cheapest one of them all, did better than some of these other more expensive spray paints. The no primer section in the end was by far better than any other no primer section. But it did pretty well in both of the primer sections as well, especially for a cheaper spray paint. Another factor of this comparison is the variety of colors and sheens that you can get in each of these types of spray paint. Krylon and Rustoleum spray paints have like 50 plus color options in at least gloss, satin, and flat sheens. Behr spray paint comes in only 21 colors and either in gloss or flat sheens. And the Color Place comes in either black or white, and only in the gloss sheen. So, what spray paint do you think won overall? I'd love to know. Let me know in the comments below.